do that welcome. Say hello, everyone, and hello to Jo when she does turn up. So, as I said, we're now into chapter 26. So we have 26, 27, and 28. We're on the last three chapters of Matthew's Gospel. And so we are really kind of hitting the crescendo period now. So last time, I've called it Motive, Means and Betrayal. And in one sense, the section we're going to look at today, it's hard exactly, although I've done it in the past and I've chosen locations, it ties together a number of things that have kind of been going on over the last couple of days. And there's a transition that goes on with the betrayal as Judas, his heart kind of sets its course. And at the same time, a character suddenly emerges out of nowhere, which is Mary. And of course, who's going to become the what in certain circles are referred to as the apostle to the apostles, because she is the first apostle of the resurrection, the first person commissioned by the resurrected Jesus and sent with a message. And so that we almost see this kind of turning over of something, and a person that you might have expected in the story falling out of the story and a new person stepping in. As we put the other Gospels together, she's not without precedent. She's been around, but her place is going to start to become more solidly, kind of concretely woven into the story. So we looked last week at the first couple of verses. We kind of peeked ahead. So it happened when Jesus had finished all these words, which is a reference back to the teaching he's been giving on the Mount of Olivet about all of those transitional things. He said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover starts and the Son of Man will be delivered over to be crucified." And there's a little timing thing here, which is one of those confusing things. It's worth noting that it's kind of going back to the Sermon on Olivet. So as Jesus is concluding those words, which is, I put and see on the afternoon of Tuesday, of the week that's been going, it's hard to squeeze it earlier. But equally, as Jesus used these words, after 2 days the Passover starts and the Son of Man will be delivered. And I think you have to see the two things together. The after 2 days is Passover will have started and also the Son of Man being delivered. Now, what does Jesus mean by that? Because obviously he eats a Passover meal, but equally in John's Gospel he is being crucified at the Passover. But I think that the kind of the terminology the Passover starts is a reflection of something which we've seen, which I think is now pretty concretely, the more you look at it, the more concrete you see it, that just as we have in the Western world and in Europe, the ways in which people say celebrate Christmas start on different days, they blend a little bit together. And we're going to see that that's actually testified to in the Gospels themselves. And as many of you know, if you've worked through the things I've done before, there's been a lot of research over the last kind of 20 or so years, because what would otherwise be the most confusing kind of idea in the Synoptic Gospels is going to appear in Matthew. Actually next week, I think it starts next week off, which is where Matthew seems to confuse the day of preparation with the day of Passover, you see. But all of those things are resolved, and you see there is a little bit of a blended period of Passover. And so the 2 days, after 2 days, the Passover will have started and the Son of Man will be delivered, and he's in the process of being crucified. It's going to be what's happening. So this is now Tuesday, as I say, afternoon, when Jesus is saying that. So during that time... So I've the little Hebrew word is one that is peppers right the way through Matthew. He uses it more than all of the other Gospels put together. We normally see it just translated as the word then. John Wenham makes the reference that Matthew uses it in the same way that the Old Testament uses a kind of a Hebrew equivalent. And although it does have a kind of a temporal connection, i.e. this happened, then this happened, is often used in kind of an Aramaic way of talking as being the next thing I'm going to tell you about. Because in a world that's not so driven by clocks, there's often an overlap. So it's not exactly that this is totally finished and then this happened. It's more that I've been telling you about this. Now I need to start to tell you about this to kind of fill out the next phase. But there's often an overlap between the two. And so I've gone with during that time. You'll often see translations do we go at that time to give the same idea. Others just go with then. So, but during that time. So that time, which is in this this period that we're in preparation for what's the flow of events with Jesus' crucifixion and trial and so on. During this previous time, the chief priests and the elders of the people were called together in the courtyard of the high priest, who is called Caiaphas. And I think that's most likely to have happened after the Monday, later in the day on Monday. So if you remember, Jesus has ridden into Jerusalem on the Sunday, and then he's gone into the temple and he's looked around and gone back. He's gone in a second day in a row, and he has totally owned, if you like, and he's turned over the money tables, and he's totally owned the court of the Gentiles in speaking to people, and there's lots of celebration going on, and the children are crying out, and he's pointed out if you shut them up, the stones will cry out. But then in the beginning of the morning of the Tuesday that we've been looking at, as Jesus has got there, it's been much more. The elders and the priests are much more coordinated. We've seen the Sadducees coming with an attack, the Pharisees coming with an attack, the scribes coming with an attack, different groups, and that attack, I suspect, represents part of the conspiracy of the priests, which is being referred to here. So after Monday, where Jesus has so owned the situation, they've met in the courtyards of the high priest, away from the crowds, in a private gathering, but a large space, same place that Jesus is eventually going to be tried. And they conferred about how they might covertly seize and kill Jesus. So they want to do it, but they know they can't do it publicly because the crowds are with him. But they reasoned not during the feast, in case there's a riot among the people. So there we have it. So that's happened a little bit before the events we've just been looking at, but it's during this time. And now in this context, Matthew brings in very quickly, now while Jesus was in Bethany, and it's ambiguous in the timing, whether it's in the afternoon, and I've tended in my reconstructions of the week, I've tended to put it on the evening of the Tuesday. A long time ago, I used to put it on the evening of the Monday, because it is, in one sense, it's a bit ambiguous, the language, and it's more kind of what's convenient to fit it into. But at some point while Jesus is in Bethany, he's gone for a meal in the house of Simon the leper. And in Matthew's way of telling us, he's indicated the plot by the Pharisees to try and take Jesus. And now he's going to tell a story that creates a little bit of a final response in Judas. Although as he tells the story, it's ambiguous whether Judas has already made contact with the priests or whether he does that afterwards. But you'll see what I mean as we go there. So while Jesus was in Bethany, while he's been going there, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. So he doesn't name the woman, and we all know her as Mary. It's interesting that now actually I'm just trying to remember. I made a note of this earlier. I spotted something when I was preparing for this today, so it's going to be in verse 3. So I've gone past it already. Let me go back. There we go. Verse 3. Sorry. I go back to verse 3, there's a nice little interesting thing to notice here. During that time, so we're looking at time of what that is being narrated by Matthew. But remember, then, if you think about it, there are words in here that are written from the time of Matthew narrating. So there's the time Matthew's narrating, and there's the time he is narrating in his message. And I want you to notice this, because again, a lot of English translations, but I've now checked it out in the various Greek sources. They go with in the courtyard of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, past, but actually it says in the Greek, it says who is called Caiaphas, and this is not dissimilar to the point I've made in John's Gospel, where John's Gospel refers to Jerusalem. There is in Jerusalem. It's in the present tense. So it looks from the point of view of the narrator, he's he's assuming that Jerusalem is still there. And it's not a kind of a sneaky thing. It's not someone faking it, which is often the modern approach to John's Gospel. That it was written about 70 or 80, those kind of that late period, after the destruction of the temple. It's just in the flow of things. He's referring to Jerusalem in the present tense, as if it's there. And that wouldn't be something you're doing if you're writing something after, when everybody knows what a catastrophe it was, that it was destroyed. You would refer back to it, but he doesn't. It's in the present tense. And here we have the high priest who is called Caiaphas. And because Caiaphas stopped being high priest in 36 AD, which by my reckoning is 3 years after the crucifixion. So those who go for a 30 AD crucifixion, it's still 36, which means that, as I've often presented, so it was a nice kind of confirmatory thing, I think that Matthew's Gospel is in the process of compilation right from almost a few days after the day of Pentecost, when they have to start presenting the apostles' teaching. And there is a process of that teaching, and I'm starting, as I look at it more, to get a sense of how that's come out. But part of that is that the large chunks of teaching that Jesus has presented are being captured, and we're told by the early church it was Matthew who captured the logia, the words. And people debate what do they mean by the logia. It doesn't say the gospel, but right at the beginning Matthew captured the words. But actually I think the things that become Matthew's gospel are what being captured and probably circulated at that point. And so here in this context, that is within literally months and the first few years, this process has started. And probably the crucifixion narratives are one of the important bits, the details of. We know that they are actually a third of the whole gospel. They're a big, big chunk for a few days. So these few days of this week or so of Jesus' life is covered by about a third of the text. So in that context, as Matthew has been recording it, he notices that it's Caiaphas who is the high priest. Now, coming back to where we were in the mix, you see that I think explains why Matthew straight away doesn't name Mary. He just refers to a woman, and it's a kind of a strange reference. Not strange reference, given that as you put all the Gospels together, there is the reference that, well, in fact, it's going to come down here that she will be remembered because of what she's done. So Matthew's actually going to say it, and it's strange he says it, but of course it doesn't actually remember her name. But actually, I think that's not that he doesn't remember her name. It's actually, as we put together the evidence from John's Gospel with the testimony of the early church, which is that Lazarus becomes a person that is actually under threat of death because of his, if you like, the miracle of his own resurrection to the resurrection then of Jesus, that he and his sisters have to leave Jerusalem because of threats to them. And at this point, where Matthew's being written right in the early phases, he's not mentioning her because those who are in the know exactly who she is, but those who don't need to be explicitly told who she is. And so Matthew presents her that way. Mark, which is the teaching of Peter but delivered in Rome, maintains the same anonymities to characters, probably because Peter's just got used to training in his public speaking to working with those anonymities. Luke is more explicit about Mary and Martha, but he doesn't actually put them in the frame here in this particular passage because he doesn't record this event. John spells the picture out perfectly. But by that time, according to the early church, they probably left Jerusalem, and so they're not under the same level of threat. They were there, and they're not there anymore. So you understand why these things come together. So here's a woman, Mary, came to him with an alabaster jar of expensive fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. As we look at Luke's telling, as I say, he misses this incident out in Jesus' last week. But he does tell us about Mary's first meeting, Mary Magdalene, he calls her, which some scholarship splits Mary of Bethany, because Jesus is in Bethany, from Mary of Magdalene. But again, I think Mary Magdalene is a part, if you like, of the slight obscuring of her true identity. Mary's never called Mary of Bethany. It's just she seems to live in Bethany. And Magdalene, why do you call someone Magdala if Magdala is up in the north, if they actually came from the south? I've looked at this. If you've gone through the in greater detail, I don't want to do it now because I want to focus on Matthew. But I think the Magdala is part of an identification, which is part of how she is remembered, as Jesus puts it. Part of her memory, which is now coming to the fore. So she's going to become the key witness of the resurrection. And she is also, she does so by anticipating something of what's going to happen to Jesus. So she approaches, she has a large flask of very expensive oil, several thousands of pounds worth of perfume. She pours it out on Jesus' head. Some of it runs down to his feet, as we read elsewhere. But seeing this, his disciples begrudged it, saying, "Why this waste?" And as Matthew tells the story, he doesn't focus just on Judas. We get that much more from John's Gospel, and no doubt Judas might have been part of the mix, but Matthew is always very honest about the failings of the disciples. And in the mix, you can see how very easily it's easy to start, what a waste. Why did she do that? It's a real statement. There's oil all over the floor now. It's all over Jesus' head and his clothing. Oil doesn't wash out easily. You can see in the kind of the muttering kind of going on. And what's more, if you really wanted to do something with that, you could have sold it and so on. So seeing that his disciples begrudged it, saying, "Why this waste?" For sure, this could have been sold for a lot and given to the poor. Jesus responds. So, but aware of this, Jesus asked, "Why are you picking on this woman?" The Greek actually does, I think, kind of lends itself to that translation, picking on. Part of it is a compound of a couple of different Greek words, kind of about three, I think. One of which is about cutting, as if you're kind of jabbing. So I think the idea of we often you'll see it translated as resenting or begrudging and so on, but I actually like the jabbing idea, so I've gone for picking on. Why are you picking on this woman, seeing as how she did a beautiful thing to me? And there's more than beautiful, as we're going to see. So there's something prophetic in it. After all, you'll always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. But pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Now, Jesus has been talking to his disciples for a while now about when he arrives in Jerusalem, he's going to come to a point and the Son of Man is going to be executed. He's talking in those terms. He's been talking about them more generally ever since he moved to the south of the country from Galilee into the Judea area, which he did after the Feast of Tabernacles the year before. So since that time, he started to talk more explicitly about what it's going to mean for him. So it's not that they've not had opportunity to hear of something of the death, but as we're going to see, it's been hard for it really to settle in the disciples. Now, what we don't know is if Mary of Bethany, who I think is Mary Magdalene, who's been part of the entourage and has been following with Jesus during that period, if she has picked up those things and she has seen them with greater clarity, or whether she's just genuinely got a sense in her spirit of the foreboding of where we've got to. However they come together, she responds and reacts in a way that Jesus deliberately commends and kind of lifts up her status. And then he gives this phrase, "So truly I tell you that wherever this gospel," so this gospel, which is going to include the events we're working through, but it's the good news of the kingdom as the disciples have had it. Wherever this good news of the kingdom is preached in all the world, what she did will be told as a reminder of her or a memorial of her. And Jesus is quite explicit here about it will make sure that people know her name. You can say I'm reading into that, but that to me is the very clear implication. Although, as I say, here's the weird thing. Matthew hasn't mentioned her, named her. But he would be aware, writing for the Jerusalem church, which Matthew is writing in Jerusalem for a Jerusalem church, that people, and while the family is still living near Jerusalem, just outside in Bethany, that everybody would know who she is. We know that Mary Magdalene is actually named, I can't remember which of the Roman historian is, but in his critique as an enemy or someone who does not like Christianity. He talks about those who belong to the sect of Mary the Magdalene. So she's kind of right from the early church. She is it's a significant label, this name. As I say, she becomes then in the Orthodox and Catholic Church, she is recognized as what they call a myrrh bearer, and she is also the apostle to the apostles, because she is the first apostle of the resurrection. We make a distinction between the apostles of the incarnation, and then there are a new wave of apostles who are sent from the resurrection, which includes more than the original 12, and she's part of that. When Paul refers to Junia, who is of note among the apostles, and people argue, does that mean that she's of note to the apostles? But no, it's among. That he is probably referring to Joanna, who is also one of the women that Jesus sent from the, because Junia and Joanna, written in Greek, are only one letter difference. One is just the Roman form of a Jewish name. So Joanna is not just an apostle because she is very specifically commended by the resurrected Jesus and sent by him to take the message of his resurrection to the disciples and further. And so Paul says of her, she's of note among the apostles, and she was in Christ before me. Acknowledging, if you like, that just as he is commissioned and sent by the resurrected Jesus, he's an apostle of the resurrection. Those women who are involved are as well. But as we know, the famous one, the big one, the one that we all remember, is Mary Magdalene. And as I say, while some Christians decide that the two are separate characters, for me, I can't see it that way, because I see so much, if you like, prophetic significance to the two people being the same person and these words as we go through them. So I may be wrong, because I can't prove it from the text, but for me it makes total resonating kind of sense of the conversation that is going on here. So in a kind of a strange way, when we get to Acts, we remember they have to replace Judas because as an apostle, somebody else ought to take his place. There is a kind of a sense in which, if you look back in the words here of Jesus, Mary is emerging just at the same point as Judas is losing faith and stepping out. And she gets recognized, as I say, in that apostolic role. So we're actually getting through quite speedily today. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, having gone to the chief priests, and again, tense-wise, tried looking at it a little bit. At the point as Matthew is telling the story, it sounds to me like he has previously already gone. Now, if the high priests had started conspiring, as I say, on Monday, given that Jesus has so dominated the temple on the Monday morning into the afternoon there, if they conspire at that point, in the morning, they may have started to kind of sound out and try and notice what's going on. And as the various factions come in to challenge Jesus with their different points, someone may have noticed or made contact and started talking to Judas and recognized that there is a possibility of Judas not being as au fait with what's going on right now, not as happy with it as some of the others. And there may have been some level, he's already now in conversation with the high priest. But so this Judas Iscariot, who's sitting there already having some level of conversation going on, says, "What are you willing to give me?" So this has happened in the past. "What are you willing to give me, and I'll deliver him up to you?" And they set aside 30 pieces of silver for him. So maybe that whole transaction has happened on the morning of the Tuesday, if this is the Tuesday evening. But from that point now, we read that Judas has decided. So from that point, he was looking for an opportunity to give Jesus up. I've put Jesus, I've got a little N. This is my new a new bit of kind of annotation for me, because I've started to work on trying to draw all of these translation bits to do this integrated text. And what that means is that there is the name there, the little N, that's why it's an N in superscript, is replacing a him. Because obviously we've been talking about Judas and him and him and him. Sometimes it's ambiguous when you just have him. So occasionally, not just with Jesus' name, what I'm doing is when you have a long section, because as you blend 4 Gospels together, you can sometimes have a long description. And if you constantly are jumping between him, sometimes you need to put the name in just to keep up with it. So that's what that little n, Jesus' name doesn't actually appear in the Greek, but I've included it to replace a him just to make it easier to specify the difference between Judas and Jesus. And then we're now going to move on. That's coming to verse 17, but we're not going there today. We're going to now move on, but at the point we're moving on, we have a day. It's the day of preparation. That's what the next verse is going to tell us. And the day of preparation, it seems that the disciples are somewhat spread out, and that makes sense. Peter and John have been sent into the city. There would also be a contingent that they have to go. Actually, it may well be Peter and John who go formally, which means all of the queuing and waiting in line and taking time to get hold of one of the lambs that has been sacrificed for Passover meals. So part of that preparation process that Jesus sends them off for. We don't know what the disciples and Jesus are doing during the day. But so in that context, it would seem that there is space for Judas to have gone up to the temple, because it is the beginning of Passover, perhaps slightly separate from the others, and reconnect, confirm what he's going to do, how he's going to do it. He doesn't yet know. He knows when, but he doesn't know exactly where. So he's made arrangements at this stage, or he's making arrangements to actually get word to the authorities at a convenient time to get the message to them. So that's where we're going into. But as we finish today, as I say, we see this kind of this phase which has happened. Difficult to exactly tie down what happens when. We can see the kind of phase of a couple of days whereby the different things have all been taking place. And in the taking place, there's a couple of folks, Judas and Mary, have stepped into very key positions which they will always be remembered for. So that's my kind of take on these 16 verses. Does anyone want to ask anything or say anything at this stage?